Um, so I want to thank you all for coming here today to read and hear this early paper of Lacan's, British Psychiatry and the War. And this little event is the inaugural event of a new initiative, the Library for Lacanian Analysis, which is organized here in London by Janet Haney, working with a few of us here in quite an open way to see what kinds of activities these signifiers, a library of Lacanian analysis, can support for us. The library takes shape with the help of money from the Psychoanalytical Notebooks, which is the publication of the London Society of the New Lacanian School. And the library takes its guiding principles in the Freudian field from a statement by Judith Miller from the International Federation of Lacanian Orientation Libraries, FIBOL. And Judith Miller states there that sustaining arguments, practicing discussion, and learning about new sources are three ways of keeping the Freudian field on the side of the enlightened.
Taking my videos off.
To do this, the libraries of the Lacanian orientation should not only supply readers with the largest possible range of publications, but should also be committed to organizing presentations, conferences, debates, and other events that make it possible to widen the scope of discussions in order to highlight the readers that take the Freudian field, the reading that takes the Freudian field forward. So that's the context of something of the context of this. And Janet had originally conceived this reading for this day, which marks 75 years since the end of World War II in Europe, to be perhaps in a pub in London, a shared experience. And then the plan had to be set aside when the pandemic got in the way. And when I spoke with Janet a little over a week ago, saying that I was missing a certain kind of shared activity with colleagues, she was quick and generous in proposing that I could see if it's possible to take up this project in a new way. So here we are. And we found partnership in this venture with our friends and colleagues and fellow cartelisans of the cartels of the NLS in India, with whom we have good and growing relations, and long may they last and prosper. And in particular, I've organized this with Ganesh, an Anthraman, who's been really a wonderful partner in work. So thank you, Ganesh. And today we have 6 readers from the NLS cartels in India and 6 from London. And we're glad in particular to be able to include in this number Sing Wang and Peggy, who coordinate the cartels respectively in India and in the UK. This text of Lacan, which was first published in 1947, was firstly a presentation made to French colleagues following a visit to England at the end of the war. And Lacan had found in the work of his colleagues in England a way of allowing those who are not otherwise well suited to working together to form groups. And this left a strong impression on Lacan, and indeed formed an important part of the logic by which he invented the device of the cartel. And so from the exigencies, the urgent situation of war, we have this precious new device, a way of working together in our work, orientated by our cause. So great thanks to our readers, Aravana, Sophia, Singwang, Arka, Oriol, Janet, Prerna, Aino, Dibyo Kamal, sorry about my pronunciation, Peggy.
Dibyo.
Thank you,
Yeah.
and Dipti. And so let's, without any further introduction, let's read Lacan's British Psychiatry in the War. And I think, Aravana, you're starting.
Yes, thank you, Alistair and Ganesh, for inviting me. Here I start. British Psychiatry and the War. When I was in London in September 1945, the fireworks had just stopped falling on the city for the day, V-Day, on which it celebrated its victory. The war left me with a keen sense of that mode of unreality under which the whole of France had lived the war from beginning to end. I am not aiming here at those fairground ideologies which rocked us from the phantasmagorias of our grandeur, akin to the ramblings of senility, or even the delirium that precedes death, to those compensatory fabulations proper to childhood. I would rather speak of the systematic misrecognition, méconnaissance of the world by each individual, namely those imaginary refuges that as a psychoanalyst I couldn't fail to identify in the group, prey as it was at that time to a truly panicked dissolution of its moral status, as being the self-same modes of defense that the individual makes use of against anxiety in neurosis, and with no less ambiguous a success, being just as paradoxically effective and in the same way, alas, sealing a destiny which is transmitted to generations. I thus thought of stepping out of the circle of this deleterious enchantment to enter another realm, one where it had been possible, after the crucial refusal of a compromise, which would have spelt defeat, to lead the struggle without letting go throughout the worst trials, to that triumphant conclusion which now makes that enormous wave which almost engulfed nations appear to them as nothing but an illusion of history, and even one whose spell was quickly broken. From my first approach until the end of my 5-week stay, this expectation of finding a different atmosphere was not disappointed, and it is in the guise of psychological evidence that I was able to discover this truth, that the British victory is of a moral order, by which I mean that the intrepidity of its people rests upon a veridical relation to the real, something that its utilitarian ideology does not easily convey. In particular, the term adaptation absolutely betrays this veridical relation to the real, a relation for which even the beautiful word realism is forbidden to us, thanks to the infamous usage with which the clercs de la trahison have debased its virtue. There's a footnote here for la trahison des clercs, which was translated as the treason of intellectuals. The phrase, now a common term in Western political thought, refers to intellectuals who engage in political advocacy and thereby compromise their integrity. So, with which the clercs de la trahison have debased its virtue through a profanation of the word, which will for a long time deprive men of such offended values. We must thus go on to speak of heroism and evoke its marks, such as they appeared from the moment I first set foot inside the city, pockmarked every 200 yards by a vertical destruction, which, having been neatly cleared, thus rested uneasily with the term ruin. The dismal prestige of this term, even when combined with the flattering intention to recall the grandeur of ancient Rome, was given a cool reception when it was extended in welcome yesterday by one of our most eminent envoys to a people who do not rest on their history. Just as austere and with no more romanticism were other signs which, according to the progress of the visitor, were uncovered either by chance or by intention, starting with the depression, which, thanks to one of those meetings on the road, combined with the solidarity perpetuated by difficult times, was described to him in somnambulant metaphors by a young woman of the leisure class on her way to celebrate her liberation from the agricultural service, for which, as a single woman, she had been drafted for 4 years, right up to the intimate exhaustion of creative forces that was revealed by doctors or men of science, painters or poets, scholars, even sinologists, who were also his interlocutors, either by their own admission or in their countenance, through an effect as general as their forced labor in the cerebral services of modern warfare, which took them to the limits of their energy, the organization of production, scientific devices for detection or camouflage, political propaganda, or secret services. Whatever may have been the form taken by this reactive depression on a collective scale since then, I can testify that at that time a tonic factor emanated from it, which I would not mention here for fear of being too subjective, if it were not for the fact that its sense was revealed to me in the field of the British effort which I was qualified to assess. Herein ends my section. So,
I am next. So, we must circumscribe the field of what has been achieved by psychiatrists in Britain for the war, and because of it, concerning first, the use that British psychiatrists made of their science in the singular and of their techniques in the plural, and secondly, what was gained by the one and the others through the experience of the war. Such, indeed, is the meaning of the title of the book by Brigadier General Rees, to which we will constantly refer, The Shaping of Psychiatry by War. It is clear that, on the basis of the principle of the total mobilization of the forces of a nation demanded by modern warfare, the question of requisite numbers, effectives, depends on the scale of the population. Thus, in a reduced group, such as that of metropolitan Britain, it was necessary that all men and women be mobilized. This question is redoubled by that of efficiency, which requires, beyond the rigorous use made of each individual, the best possible circulation of the most daring conceptions of those in charge, and their transmission right down to the last man in the chain of command. No doubt, it is a problem about which psychological rationalization will always have something to say. But the qualifications acquired in times of peace, the high political education of the British people, and an already expert propaganda may well have proved sufficient. It was a completely different matter to constitute an army on a national scale from scratch, in the manner of continental armies, in a country which until then only had a small professional army, for it obstinately opposed conscription right up to the eve of the conflict. One needs to take full account of the fact that a still very young psychological science was called upon to effect what one may call the synthetic creation of an army, when this science had barely brought to the light of rational thought the notion of such a body, understood as a social group with an original structure. It is indeed in the writings of Freud that both the question of leadership and that of morale were posed for the first time in the scientific terms of the relation of identification. I'm referring here to this whole incantation designed to absorb the fears and anxieties of each individual in the solidarity of a group in life and in death, which until then had been the monopoly of the practitioners of military art. A conquest of reason, which comes to integrate tradition itself by lightening it and raising it to a second power. On the occasion of the two astounding victories of the Normandy landings and the crossing of the Rhine, we were able to see that with an equivalent standard of equipment and with the military tradition being all on the side of the army, which had elevated it to the highest degree that the world had ever known, a tradition further reinforced by the recent moral addition of a democratization of hierarchical relations, the anguishing value of which had been indicated by us as a factor of superiority when we returned from the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. All the might of this tradition did not weigh an ounce against the superior conceptions of tactics and strategy, the products of the calculations of engineers and mongers. It was no doubt in this way that the mystification attached to a military training of the order of caste and school, in which the officer retained the shadow of the sacred character which adorned the ancient warrior, was finally dissipated. Besides, we know, through the example of the other of the victors, that there is no other such constituted body to which one could take an axe with greater profit to a people. It is indeed on a scale of a fetishism which yields its ripest fruits in Central Africa, that one must evaluate the still flourishing use to which such a body is put with regard to providing a reserve for the nation's idols. In any case, it is recognized that the traditional position of command does not favor intelligent initiative. This is no doubt why, in Britain, when events precipitated themselves at the start of 1939, the highest authorities could be seen to turn down a project presented by the health service of the army, which proposed to organize not only the physical, but also the mental instruction of recruits. And yet, the principle of this project had been applied in the United States as early as the previous war through the impetus of Dr. Thomas W. Somon.
So this is why Britain only had a dozen specialists available under the command of Rees in London when war broke out in September. 2 consultants attached to the expeditionary body in France and 2 posted in India. In 1940, cases flooded hospitals under the heading of maladjustment, various delinquencies, and psychoneurotic reactions, and it is due to the pressure of this emergency that the action, the flexibility, and the scope of which we will now demonstrate was organized with the help of some 250 psychiatrists brought in through conscription. A kindling spirit had preceded them. Colonel Hargreaves, who set up an initial trial of eliminatory testing adapted from the Spearman test, which had already been used as an inspiration in Canada to give shape to the Penrose-Raven test. The system that has subsequently been adopted is that referred to as PUHEMS, already tested in the Canadian Army, in which a scale from 1 to 5 is ascribed to each of the 7 symbolic letters, which correspond respectively to general physical capacity, upper limbs, lower limbs, hearing, eyes, mental capacity, namely intelligence, and lastly, affective stability. 2 notations out of 7 are those of a psychological order. A first selection is made from the recruits, which removes the inferior 10%. So here is a note. Let us note in passing that in Britain, just as it is policemen who, as the representative of civil authority, hates any military parade on the public highway, It is the Ministry of Employment that fulfill the functions of our Council Division and decide which of the citizens will be army recruits. Let us emphasize that this selection does not concern the critical and technical qualities which are required by the prevalence of the function of transmission in modern warfare, nor the subordination of the combat group to the service of weapons that are no longer instruments but machines. What is at stake is to obtain in the group a certain homogeneity held to be an essential factor for its morale. Indeed, any intellectual or physical deficit takes on an affective value for a subject within the group through the process of horizontal identification, touched upon in the work of Freud evoked earlier, where it is, however, neglected in favor of the identification that one may call vertical, led to the leader. The subject affected by too strong a deficit must be isolated as dullards, for indeed they are slow coaches at instruction, ravaged by the feeling of their inferiority, maladjusted and prone to delinquency, not so much through lack of understanding as through impulses of the compensatory order, and consequently are the favored terrain of depressive or anxious raptors, or confusional states manifesting themselves under the emotional or physical shocks incurred on the front line, natural carriers of all forms of mental contagion. Our friend Dr. Turkey, with us today, has indicated the French equivalent of the term dullard to be lourd rather than arriéré, retarded. In other words, it refers to what our colloquial vocabulary designated with the word débile, which expresses less a mental level than the evaluation of personality. All the same, as soon as they are grouped together, these subjects prove themselves to be infinitely more efficient through a liberation of their goodwill, correlative to a sociability that is now well matched. Even the sexual motivation of their infractions diminishes, as if to demonstrate that they do not so much depend upon a so-called prevalence of instincts as present a compensation for their social isolation. At least, this is what was evidenced in the utilization in Britain of the residue that America could afford to do without. After having employed them for agricultural labor, such subjects later had to be employed as pioneers, although they were kept behind the front line. The units, which had been purified of their inferior elements in this way, experienced a decrease in phenomena of shock and neurosis, and the effects of a collective softening of the will, in the proportion which one could call geometrical. Major general reads see the application of this fundamental experience to a social problem of our civilization as being immediately accessible to practice, without for all that acceding in any way to the Schaber's theories of eugenics, being completely opposed, as one can see, to the anticipatory myth of Huxley's Brave New World. Oh, there's another note.
Yes, read it.
Yeah, should I continue? Okay, there's another note on a Brave New World. It is thus that we are led upon a terrain where 1,000 research on small points rigorously bring to light all kinds of psychogenetic correlation, thanks to the use of statistics, which, it must be said, have nothing to do with what the physician designates under the name in his specific communication, which are already interesting and at the simplest of levels, such as the curve of increasing and continuing correlation of scabies and lice in relation to the decrease of mental capacity, but which take on a doctrinal importance when they allow us to establish a link between the inadequacy of the subject with his function and a bad social positioning, a gastrointestinal infection that in their language one designate approximately as the dyspepsia of the re-enlisted soldier.
Thank you, Alistair and Ganesh. We continue. Here, several disciplines find the locus for their cooperation, disciplines with which all of us will have to become familiar, however theoretical some of us may consider them to be. For it is on this condition alone that we can and must justify the prominence which is ours wherever the psychological sciences are used on a collective scale. If during the war experience, British psychiatrists have indeed made this recognized, and with a success which I will return to, it is due, as we will see, not only to the great number of psychoanalysts in their midst, but also to the fact that they have all been permeated by the diffusion of the concepts and modus operandi of psychoanalysis. For there are disciplines, such as the so-called psychology of groups, which although they may have barely appeared upon our horizon, have reached a sufficient level of elaboration in the Anglo-Saxon world to be expressed in the work of one Kurt Lewin at the mathematical level of a vectorial analysis, no less. Thus, in a long conversation I had with two physicians I am about to introduce as pioneers of this revolution, a revolution which transports all our problems to the collective scale, I heard one of them explain to me coolly that as far as group psychology was concerned, the Oedipus complex was the equivalent of what in physics one calls the problem of the three bodies. A problem for which, as is well known, a complete solution was never found. But in our country, it is considered good taste to smile at speculations of this sort without, for all that, being any more cautious in dogmatism. Thus, I'm going to try to present these two men for you, au naturel, men of whom it can be said that the flame of creation burns in them. In the first, this flame is as if frozen in a motionless and lunar mask, accentuated by the thin commas of a black mustache, which no less than the high stature and swimmer's thorax which support him, give the lie to the Krishmarian formulations, since everything about him alerts us to the fact that we are in the presence of one of those beings who remain solitary even in the utmost commitment, as is confirmed in his case by his exploit in Flanders, where he followed his assaulting tank with whip in hand and thus paradoxically forced the weft of destiny. In the other, this flame scintillates behind a lorgnette to the rhythm of a verb burning to return to action. In the man who, with a smile which makes his fawn brush bristle, likes to recall how he completed his experience as analyst with the management of men tested in the fire at Petrograd in October 1917. The former, Dion, and the latter, Rickman, have published together in an issue of The Lancet, 27 November 1943, which is the equivalent both in its audience and in its format to our Presse Médicale, an article that, though amounting to only 6 newspaper columns, will mark a historic date in psychiatry. Under the significant title, Intra-Group Tensions in Therapy, Their Study as the Task of the Group, the authors bring us a concrete example of their activities in a military hospital with the unadorned clarity it casts on both the occasion and the principles of the said activities, and with perfect humility, I would add, takes on the value of a demonstration of method. I find in their work, something of the miraculous feeling of the initial stages of the Freudian elaboration, that of finding in the very impasse of a situation the vital force of an intervention. Here we find Bion having to deal with some 400 odd birds, oiseaux, in a service that goes under the banner of re-education. The anarchical importunities of their occasional needs, requests for exceptional authorizations, chronic irregularities of their situation are going to appear to him from the outset as designed to paralyze his work by subtracting hours from his working time, already arithmetically insufficient to solve the structural problem posed by each case if taken one by one. It is from this very difficulty that Bion will begin in order to cross the Rubicon of a methodical innovation. Indeed, how are these men to be considered in their present situation, if not as soldiers who cannot submit themselves to discipline, and who will thus remain closed to the positive therapeutic effects which depend upon it, for the reason that it is the very factor which brought them together here in the first place? But what does it take to turn this aggregate of irreducible characters, what one calls a disciplinary company, into a functioning troop within a theater of war? 2 elements: the presence of the enemy, which solders the group in the face of a common threat, and a leader whose experience of men allows him to set as precisely as possible the margin to be allowed for their weaknesses, and who can maintain this margin through his authority. In other words, through the fact that everybody knows that once a responsibility is assumed, he does not chicken out. Il ne se dignifie pas. The author is one such leader for whom the respect of man is consciousness of self, and who is able to support anyone wherever he takes him. As for the common danger, does it not rest in the very extravagances which undermine the rationale behind these men's stay here, for indeed they oppose the primary conditions of their recovery? But it is necessary to make them aware of it. And this is where the psychoanalyst's spirit intervenes, the psychoanalyst who is going to deal with the sum of the obstacles opposing this awareness, like this resistance or systematic misrecognition, mechanoisos, he learned to handle in the treatment of neurotic individuals. But here, he's going to treat it at the level of the group.
Oriol, you have to take over from Orko. Is he there?
No, Oriol?
I'm happy to read in his place, because in case I have to leave earlier, maybe if he...
Yes, you could do that, Peggy.
Yes? Okay.
Yes. If you're happy to do that, we're happy for you to do that.
Sure, just tell me where to stop, though.
Ganesh, can you keep an eye on that?
Okay.
I shall.
All right, so
Yep.
I'll start and you just tell me where to stop. In the prescribed situation, Bion has even more of a hold on the group that the psychoanalyst has on the individual, since by right at least, and then as leader, he is part of the group. But this is precisely what the group does not really realize. This is why the doctor will have to pass via the feigned inertia of the analyst and rely upon the only factual hold he is given, namely keeping the group within the reach of his words. On this basis, he will undertake to organize the situation so as to force the group to become aware of the difficulties of its existence as a group, and then to render it more and more transparent to itself, to the point where each of its members may be able to judge adequately the progress of the whole, bearing in mind that the ideal of such an organization for the doctor lies in its perfect legibility, such that he may be able to appreciate at any time the exit towards which each case entrusted to his care is traveling, whether this be a return to his unit, release into civilian life, or persistence in neurosis. Here is a brief account of the regulation he promulgates during an inaugural meeting of all the men. A certain number of groups will be formed, each defined by an object of occupation, but they will be left entirely to the initiative of the men. That is to say, that not only will each individual aggregate to a group of his own accord, but that he will also be able to promote a new group according to his own idea, with only this limitation, that the object of the new group be itself new. In other words, that it should not serve the same function as that of another group. It is of course understood that it remains possible for each at any time to find rest in the ad hoc dormitory without any other obligation than to declare it to the head warden. The examination
Peggy,
of the proper...
Peggy, if I can interrupt, I'm sorry, but go a little slower.
Okay.
We have all the time.
Okay, yes.
Yes, thank you.
The examination of the progress of things established in this way will be the object of a general assembly which will take place every day at 10 to 12 and will last for half an hour. The article makes us follow, in a captivating progression, the first oscillation of men at the announcement of measures which, considering how things are usually conducted in such places, engender vertigo, and I can imagine the effect they would have produced in my former department at the Val de Grace Hospital. Then the first shabby formations which present themselves rather as a means of putting the good faith of the doctor to the test, and soon the men take to the game, setting up a carpentry workshop, a preparatory course for liaison officers, a course in practical cartography, a vehicle maintenance workshop, and even a group devoted to the daily task of updating a clear diagram detailing the activities in progress and the participation of each person. Reciprocally, the doctor, taking the men to task as they themselves took him at his word, quickly enough finds the occasion for denouncing, in their own acts, this inefficiency which he incessantly hears them blaming on the functioning of the army, and suddenly the crystallization of an autocritique materializes in the group, marked among other things by the appearance of a voluntary chore which day after day changes the appearance of the rooms, from now on mopped and tidy, by the first calls made upon authority, the collective protestation against slackers, profiteers from the effort of others, and indeed one can think of the indignation of this despoiled group. This episode is not in the article, the day that the leather scissors disappeared. But each time his intervention is called for, Bion, with the firm patience of the psychoanalyst, returns to the ball to those concerned. No punishment, no replacement of scissors. Slackers are a problem put to the reflection of the group, as is that of the preservation of the scissors for work. Until such problems are solved, the more active ones will carry on working for the others, and the purchase of new scissors will be made at the expense of all. In these conditions, Bion does not lack guts, and when a wise guy proposes to institute a dance class, far from responding with a reminder of the proprieties that without doubt the very promoter of the idea aimed to provoke, he knows how to bank on a more secret motivation, which he discerns in the feeling of inferiority felt by any man denied the honor of fighting. Thus, oblivious to potential criticism, even scandal, he relies on it for social stimulation by deciding that the classes will be given in the evenings after work by female officers of the ATS of the hospital. These initials designate drafted women, and that these classes will be reserved for those who know nothing of dance and have yet to learn. and in effect, the class, which takes place in the presence of the officer occupying the function of hospital director, achieves for these men an initiation into a style of behavior which, thanks to its prestige, reawakens in them the feeling of their dignity. Within a few weeks, the service said to be that of re-education becomes the seat of a new spirit that the officers recognized in the men at the time of collective events, those of a musical order, for example. During such events, the officers entertained a more familiar relation with the men, giving birth to the team spirit characteristic of the department, and which impressed itself upon the newcomers who arrived on the departure of those it had marked with its good effects. The feeling that there were conditions specific to the existence of the group, maintained by the constant action of the animating doctor, is what held it together. Here we find the principle of a group treatment grounded upon the testing and becoming aware of the factors required for there to be a good group spirit. This treatment takes on its original value in comparison to various other attempts made in Anglo-Saxon countries in the same register but using different means.
Thank you, Peggy. Yeah, that's where Alasdair steps in. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy.
Over to you, Alasdair. Yes.
Indeed. Rickman applies the same method in observation room, where he is dealing with a smaller number of patients, but also with a regrouping of less homogeneous cases. He must therefore combine it with individual interviews, but it is always from the same angle that the problems of the patients are approached. In this regard, he makes the following remark, which to some will seem striking, that if one can say that the neurotic is egocentric and loathes an effort of cooperation, it is perhaps because he's rarely placed in an environment where every member would be on the same footing as himself when it comes to relating to one's counterpart, semblable. Of course, I offer the formula to those of my auditors who contend that the condition of all rational treatment of mental disorders lies in the creation of a neo-society in which the patient would maintain or restore a human exchange, the very disappearance of which alone redoubles the depreciating effects of the disorder. If I have lingered upon the reproduction of the lively details of the experience, it is because they seem to me to be pregnant with a birth of sorts that is a new outlook opening upon the world. And if there are some who object to this view of the specifically British nature of some traits, I will respond to them that this is one of the problems to be submitted to this new viewpoint, namely, how is the mobilizable share of the psychical effort of a group to be determined? And does its specific rate vary according to the cultural area? Once the mind has conceived a new register of determination, it cannot escape from it so easily. On the other hand, such a register gives a clearer sense to some of the observations that have expressed themselves with less success in the systems of reference already in use, such as the formula that circulates without reservation in the discourse of my friend, the psychoanalyst Torquay, when he tells me of the homosexual structure in the military profession in Britain, and when he asks me whether this formula is applicable to the French army. There should be nothing surprising in the realization that any specialized social organism finds a favorable element in a specific deformation of the individual type, when all our experience of man indicates that it is it's the very insufficiencies of his psychology which support the greatest fecundity of his psychism. Thus, by reference to the indications I was able to extract from a piecemeal experience, I respond to him that virile worth expressed in the most extreme types of traditional officer training in our country appeared to me on several occasions to be a compensation for what our ancestors would call a certain weakness in pleasures. faiblesse or déduit. The experience is undoubtedly less decisive than the one I had in 1940 of a molecular phenomena played out on a national scale. I mean the macerating effect of the man, of a physical predominance of familial satisfactions, and this unforgettable procession in the specialized department to which I was attached, of subjects not quite awoken from the warmth of the skirts of mother and wife, who, thanks to evasions which led them more or less regularly to their periods of military instruction, without there being any object of any psychological selection, found themselves promoted to the ranks, which are the nerves of the fight, from heads of section to captain. My own rank did not allow me to have any access in any way other than by hearsay to samples we have of the higher echelons' inaptitude for war. I will only indicate that there I found once more on a collective scale the degradation of the virile type that I had linked to the social decadence of the paternal imago in a publication of On the Family in 1938. This is not a digression, for it is on the question of the recruitment of officers that psychiatric initiative has shown its most brilliant results in Britain. At the beginning of the war, an empirical recruitment based on rank turned out to be absurd. Firstly, because one realized very quickly that one is far from being able to make even a mediocre officer out of an excellent non-commissioned officer, far from it, and that when an excellent non-commissioned officer has demonstrated his failure as an officer to be, he returns to his corps in a bad non-commissioned officer. Furthermore, such a recruitment could not respond in the immensity of the demand for a national army to be recruited entirely ex nihilo. The question was solved satisfactorily thanks to the apparatus of psychological selection, of which it can be said that it is a wonder that it could immediately be equal to what was previously achieved after years of training.
The selection, the major selection trial for officers was the first and the broadest prior to any special instruction. It took place during a 3-day stay in a centre where the candidates were accommodated. The familial relations of a common life with the members of their jury meant that they offered themselves all the better to the jury's observation. Over these 3 days, the candidates were to be subjected to a series of examinations, which did not aim so much to ascertain their technical capacities, or IQ, but to circumscribe their personality, particularly with regard to that equilibrium in the relation with others, which itself commands the very disposition of abilities, their useful proportion in the function of a leader, and in the conditions of combat. All trials have thus been centred on the detection of factors of personality. First, written trials, which include a questionnaire regarding the personal and familial antecedents of the candidates, tests of verbal association, tests designed by Murray, said to evaluate thematic apperception, and which have to do with the signification attributed by the subject to images which evoke, in an ambiguous fashion, scenarios and themes of intense affective tension. These images, now being circulated, are very expressive of a number of traits specific to British and even more so to American psychology. Lastly, by the drafting of 2 portraits of the subject, such as he can imagine them to be produced, respectively, by a friend and a severe detractor. Then comes a series of trials in which the subject is placed in a quasi-real situation whose obstacles and difficulties vary according to degree of inventiveness of the examiners and which reveal the candidates' fundamental attitudes when tackling men and things. I will mention, for its theoretical import, the trial said to be that of the group without a leader, which, once again, we owe to the doctrinal reflections of Bion. Teams of about 10 subjects are constituted, none of them being invested with a pre-established authority, and given a task which they must solve in collaboration, the gradual difficulties of which call for constructive imagination, a capacity for improvisation, qualities of foresight, and a sense of productivity. For example, the group must cross a river using a certain material requiring a maximum of ingenuity in its use, without neglecting to arrange for its recovery, etc. During the trial, some subjects will distinguish themselves through the quality of their initiative and the ability to give orders, which will have allowed them to make their initiative prevail. But the observer will note not so much what appears of each subject's capacities as a leader, but the extent to which he is willing to subordinate the concern of looking good to the common objective pursued by the team in which it is to find its unity. The marking associated with this trial is only retained for the first selection. When the procedure was first implemented, an interview with a psychiatrist in the free and confidential manner proper to analysis was offered to each of the candidates. Later on, and for time-saving reasons, this interview was reserved for subjects who had drawn attention to themselves in the previous trials by questionable reactions. 2 points deserve to be retained. 1, the sense of fair play, which in candidates responded to the principle of authenticity that a psychoanalytic interview is supposed to make intervene in the last resort. The most commonly received testimony being that the trial concluded itself, for those who underwent it, with the feeling of having lived a most interesting experience, even when coming from those who had been judged unsuitable. The second point is the part played here by the psychiatrist, a part on which we will pause for a moment. Even though the procedure was conceived, set up and perfected by psychiatrists, namely Witkauer, Roger, Sutherland and Bion, in principle, the psychiatrist only has a single voice in the decisions of the jury. The president and vice president are seasoned officers, selected for their military experience. The psychiatrist is on an equal footing with the psychologist, what we call here a psychotechnician, a specialist, or social worker, as they are also called, and who have a very definite social status in Britain, and yet were less numerous than in the United States. Their multiplication in conditions of shortened formation imposed by the war must now pose a problem for their reabsorption. One finds them in much greater numbers in Anglo-Saxon countries, due to the much broader use to which they are put in the functions of public assistance, social security, professional orientation, or even in privately instigated processes of selection initiated with a view to industrial productivity. Even the sergeants, to whom the supervision and collation of the trials were entrusted, were involved in at least part of the deliberations. To conclude, one can thus see that the assessment of a candidate seeks the guarantee of its objectivity more in terms of largely human motivations than on the basis of mechanical operations.
But the voice of the psychiatrist takes on such authority in this concert that it demonstrates to him what social task his function imposes on him. This single discovery made by the interested parties, who all testify to it in a univocal fashion, and sometimes to their own surprise, forces those that only want to conceive this function from the limited angle defined until now by the word alienist, to recognize that they are in fact destined to a defense of man, which promotes them, whether they want it or not, to an eminent function in society. The opposition to such a widening of their duties by psychiatrists themselves, a widening which, in our opinion, responds both to an authentic definition of psychiatry as science and to its true position as human art, is no less marked, believe me, in Britain than in France. Except that in Britain, this opposition had to give way for all of those who participated in the activity of war, in the same way that the opposition to treating psychologists who were not qualified as doctors on an equal footing fell away. In the last analysis, we can see that the latter pertains to a noli me tangere that one finds more than frequently at the root of the medical vocation, no less than in that of the man of God and the man of law. Indeed, these are the three professions which assure a man that he will find himself in a position in which superiority over his interlocutor is guaranteed in advance. Fortunately, the formation brought to us by our practice may result in our being somewhat less likely to be easily offended, at least for those of us whose personal debt is little enough to be able to draw profit from it for their own catharsis. The latter will gain access to this sensitivity to human depths, which no doubt is not our privilege, but which must be our qualification. Thus, not only will the psychiatrist hold an honorable and dominant position in advisory functions, such as those evoked above, but he also will see new pathways offering themselves to him, opened by experiences such as that of the area psychiatrist. This function, which was also inaugurated in the British Army, can be translated as follows: psychiatrist attached to a military region. He is released from any constraints of service and is only subordinated to the highest authorities. His function is to investigate, foresee, and intervene in all that concerns the mental health of the drafted men in a determined district with regard to regulations and living conditions. It is in this way that one was able to define and control factors which cause certain psychical epidemics, mass neurosis, various forms of delinquency, desertions, suicides, and what a whole order of social prophylaxis seems possible for the future. Such a function will no doubt find its place in the implementation of the Beveridge Report, which, let us note, recommends that the proportion of the space designated for the treatment of cases of neurosis should amount to 5% of general hospitalization, a figure that goes way beyond all that has been planned so far for mental prophylaxis. Rees, in the book to which we constantly refer, sees the function of the area psychiatrist in times of peace as covering a region of between 50 and 75,000 inhabitants. His competence would concern all that can be recognized as having an influence on the mental hygiene of such a population with regard to its conditions of subsistence and social relations. Indeed, can one still afford to be constantly splitting hairs over the psychogenesis of mental disorders when statistics have once more demonstrated the striking phenomenon of reduction that occurs in a state of war in the number of cases of mental diseases, and this in the army as well as in civilian life. This phenomenon has been no less marked in Britain, thus giving the lie to the presumed effects of bombing on a civilian population. We know that the statistical correlates of the phenomenon do not allow even an inexperienced examination to relate this to any contingent cause, such as alcohol restriction, diet, or the effects, even psychological, of foreign occupation, etc. On a different point, Rees' book offers an intriguing perspective on the palpably better prognosis for cases of psychosis when they are treated in the markedly less isolating conditions of the military world. The footnote says, in passing, I wish to draw attention to the statistics of 2 British practitioners who are not psychiatrists, in which they demonstrated the correlation between peptic and duodenal ulcers and the zones of air bombardment.
To return to the contribution of psychiatry to the war effort, I will not dwell on the special selections carried out for commando troops, the armored divisions, the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. Those which had been previously organized on the basis of measurements concerning sensorial acuteness and technical skill had to be supplemented by the qualifications regarding personality, the province of the psychiatrist. For, by way of example, when it comes to entrusting a pilot with a plane costing an average of £1 million, typical reactions such as blindly rushing forward under fire take on their full import with regard to the risks involved, and indeed the doctrinal exclusions implemented by the Germans did not prevent them, in order to ward off such reactions, from resorting to psychoanalytical investigations which had proved their worth. In the same way, psychiatrists could be found on all fronts, in Burma, in Italy, with commando troops, at air and naval bases, and their critique was everywhere, exercised on the significant knots revealed by symptoms and behavior. In the same way, episodes of collective depression appeared in a very eclectic way in commando units which had been the object of an insufficient process of selection. And I will evoke only that young psychiatrist who, in rejoining the paratroops he was to follow to the Italian front, carried in his small aviator's package Melanie Klein's book, which had introduced him to the notion of bad objects, introjected during the phase of excremental interests, as well as during even earlier period, that of oral sadism, a view which proved to be fruitful for understanding subjects already situated psychologically by their voluntary recruitment. Psychoanalytical views were no less prominent once the war was over and were used for the task of reinserting war prisoners and overseas fighters back into civilian life. A certain number of special centers were designed for this task, one of which, set in the princely estates of Hatfield House, then still the residence of the Marquis of Salisbury, and which had remained purer in its original architecture for not having left the hands of the Cecil family since its construction in the 16th century, was visited by me on one of those glorious days often offered by London in October, and with a particular generosity this year. I was allowed to wander freely for long enough to convince myself of the entire freedom enjoyed by those housed there, a freedom that proved compatible with the upkeep of ancient paintings in a room as big as the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, and which was used as a dormitory, no less than with respect of order in the refectory where, as a guest, I was able to witness that men and officers regrouped according to their taste in the shadow of an impressive guard of suites of armor. I was able to converse with Major Doyle, to whom I first introduced myself, and also with his medical team. Regarding Major Doyle, I will relate only two of his statements. First, that the essential problem consisted in the reduction of the fantasies which had taken a predominant function in the psychicism of the subject during their years of distance or reclusion. Secondly, that the method of treatment animating the center found its inspiration in the principles of Moreno's psychodrama. In other words, of a therapist set up in America and one which must be classified amongst group psychotherapies with analytical filiation. Here, let us simply indicate that catharsis in this method is obtained in the subjects, even and particularly for psychotics, by allowing them to approach in a role they are made to play in a scenario partially left to their improvisation. In the same way here, the path that will allow so many subjects to return from imaginary evasions of becoming a publican or some unbounded profession and to return to their previous employment will include the following: discussion meetings, whether free or directed, all kinds of trial workshops, absolute freedom in the use of their time. My first discovery of the place had allowed me to marvel that some would enjoy wandering amongst the chimneys and sharp angles of a roof worthy of the imagination of Gustave Doré, visits to factories, or discussions of contemporary social and technical problems. They will not be short of the qualified counsel of social workers and legal advisors in order to settle their familial and professional difficulties. To evaluate the importance of the work, suffice it to say that 80% of the men belonging to the above-mentioned categories choose freely to go through this gradual reintegration process, éclusage, where they stay in on average 6 weeks, but which can be shortened or prolonged upon their demand. At the end of my visit, the return of the director, Colonel Wilson, gave me the satisfaction of hearing statements which made me feel that on the social front, the war had not left Britain in the state mentioned by the Gospels as that of the divided kingdom.
Thus, psychiatry served to forge the instrument thanks to which Britain won the war. Conversely, the war has transformed psychiatry in Britain. Here, as in other domains, war proved itself to be the midwife of progress. In the essentially conflictual dialectics which, indeed, seem to be characteristic of our civilization, my presentation stops at the point where the horizons that throw us into public life, even, God forbid, into politics, unveil themselves. No doubt, we will find objects of interest there that will compensate us for all those fascinating pieces of work, such as the dosage of products for uraic disintegration in fabulating paraphrenia, themselves the unquenchable products of the snobbery of a mock postiche science, a snobbery through which the prevailing feeling of inferiority due to the prejudices of medicine towards a psychiatry already out of date found its compensation. Since the path of large-scale social selection has been set, and that, ahead of public powers, powerful private organizations such as Hawthorne Western Electric in the United States have already implemented it to their benefit, how can one fail to see that the state will have to implement similar provisions for the benefit of all? And indeed, one can already estimate that the units on which the selection will have to bear will average 200,000 workers in order to achieve a fair distribution of the more perspicacious subjects as well as dullards. How is it possible not to see that our association to the civil servant, the administrator, and the psychotechnician is already inscribed in organizations such as those called child guidance in the United States and Britain. Do not confuse our acceptance of this with a pseudo-realism always in quest of a qualitative degradation. At no point of the achievements that we put forward as examples have we forgotten the high moral tradition that remains imprinted upon them. All these achievements were governed by a spirit of sympathy towards people, which is not absent either from the segregation of the dullards, where no degradation of the respect owed to all men appears. Let it be sufficient to recall that through the most constraining exigencies of a war vital for the group, and the very development of an apparatus for psychological intervention, which constitutes in itself a temptation to power, the principle of conscientious objection has been maintained in Britain. It must be said that the risks implied by such a respect for collective interests have appeared in experience to amount to infinitesimal proportions. For this war has, I think, sufficiently demonstrated that it is not from too great an indocility of individuals that the dangers for the future of humanity will come. It is now clear that the dark powers of the superego make alliances with the most cowardly abandonments of conscience to lead men to a death accepted for the least human causes, and that all that appears as sacrifice is not, for all, that heroic. On the other hand, the development of means of action on psychism that will increase in this century, a concerted handling of images and passions which has already been used successfully against our judgment, our resolution, our moral unity, will be the occasion of a new abuses of the power. There's the footnote. There is a special issue of psychological warfare, which, in our opinion, is not about to be published in the near future. Go back. It would seem to us worthy of French psychiatry that through the very tasks proposed to it by a demoralized country, it should know how to formulate its duties in such terms as would safeguard the principles of truth.
Thank you, Dibyu. Is
So
Oriol?
now, yeah, I don't
Yes.
think I'm here, but yeah, if I have to go, I'm sorry. So if someone can take over. Yeah.
Right now, Peggy?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
This is my part. Yes.
then I would ask Deepti to read the whole section because she is prepared that she has to step in for you. Deepti, are you ready? I saw her.
I can continue.
No,
I
hang
can.
on.
Can you hear me? As well.
Ah, there she is. Hi, Deepti. Yes.
Okay, I'll start.
Yes, thank you.
The President, Dr. Bonhomme, salutes our guests, Major Turqui of British Army, posted with the French Army, and Dr. Berman, Argentinian delegate to the United Nations Section for Medicine and Hygiene. He thanks Dr. Lacan for his brilliant lecture and opens the discussion. Major Turqui. It was in fact the army doctors who, in their capacity as members of the Army Council in 1935, rejected a project of selection for recruitment. During the hostilities, we had struggled in order to instate the psychiatrist as an assistant to the command, a staff officer. The role of the psychiatrist, as just presented to you, proved itself to be particularly efficient. In Burma, for example, one saw the psychiatrist, assistant to the command at the level of the division, give the advice not to make use of such or such battalion on the grounds that these reinforcement units demonstrated an insufficient psychological integration into the groups that were already engaged. It must be noted that political propaganda in the army was also inspired as to its principle and driven by psychiatrists. Thanks to them, a bi-monthly information journal dealing with the news of world politics, together with an idea of the ends of the war, came to give the soldier the feeling that he was fighting for a number of aims, which he morally and politically condoned. I must insist on the truly leading role of psychoanalysts in the work of research and decision concerning the morale of the troops. The psychiatrist is becoming ever more of a social doctor and must apply himself to the study of political phenomena such as fascism. The work of Beyond on the conflicts of the group and the individual, the concrete applications of the work of Melanie Klein must be taken as models. We have attempted to establish a democratic army where the leader represents a function itself defined by the needs of the group. One can say that his person is born from the group. This is why back home, when the needs of the group change, we resort to different leaders. The Freudian analysis of the function of the leader as representing the need for a good father responds to an unconscious relation which still prevails in the feelings of the military man. The stake is to be able to make use of this function within the framework of more elaborate intentions. A number of original perspectives brought in by group psychology have lent themselves to utilization, particularly Kurt Levin's orientations on the relations between the quality of intelligence and the conditions of the external world that one may call topographical. Professor Berman, I would like to draw attention to the contrast there is between the effacement of British psychiatry in the previous war and the prodigious development. The veritable renovation its performance showed in this war. This renovation did not take its impulse either from the neurologist or the asylum doctors, or even in most cases official spheres, but from psychotherapists and all of those who had an interest in psychogenesis. My 1938 visit to Dr. Rees, then director of the Tavistock Clinic, allowed me to appreciate the private nature of this clinic, a trait shared with most British hospitals until the reform produced by the war itself, the very lively environment it constituted. Psychogenetic theory developed considerably under the pressure of events. Recall the remarkable studies on the topic of psychogenetic ulcers. I remind you of the doctrinal interest of Dr. Costa's paper on the effort syndrome during the American Civil War, of the reports published in the Journal of Mental Science, and of the discussion held at the Royal Medical Association on this syndrome, namely the demonstration of Professor Lewis of the Maudsley Hospital of the psychogenetic origin of the syndrome in over 90% of the cases. In my opinion, the indication of a sociological sense on which this new psychiatry is orienting itself should be developed as much as possible, for it is psychiatrists' business to concern itself with the problem currently posed by the moral health of nations, as it is presented in the preamble to the World Health Organization, a section of the United Nations. Lastly, allow me to mention in passing the value of some studies of the Nazi mentality carried out by psychologists and psychoanalysts, such as that of Colonel T.H. Wilson. Dr. Borel, I can but feel sympathetic towards the new orientation psychiatry found in the war. I can but approve most of the theses which have been presented here, since in my own hospital experience, the events have modified in very noticeable proportion the number of psychoses and even that of organic psychosis. Dr. Henry E.Y., I have been extremely interested by all that the speaker taught me. I would perhaps have been even more so had he been able to lead me somewhat more concretely in the field of group psychotherapy. I myself also follow with great interest all these psychotechnical studies conducted in the British Army under the direction of men such as Rees and Turquoise. This being said, the image that outlines itself at the horizon of a certain social conception of psychiatry does not appeal to me very much. I'm far from recognizing in it a sign of progress for psychiatric science, and would rather be inclined to see there the signs of its dissolution. And I'm weighing my words here in banality and in a certain sense in normality. By extending indefinitely the object that it purports to embrace, psychiatry exposes itself to no longer being able to clasp the one that is proper to its nature, psychosociology, Psychosociology and all its objects, individual interactions, the collective tension of a group, its organization and variations, seems to me to be compatible with the function of the psychiatrist only if the object of psychiatry were itself to be solely grounded upon the social nature of a mental disease. And I inscribe myself as a detractor to such a conception. This condition does not prevent me from recognizing that in the face of the lack of veritable concrete spirit on the part of qualified psychosociologists, the task that should be theirs to assume by right does in fact fall upon us. But we must remain conscious of that fact. I have myself just lived through the experience of the part that a doctor, a fortiori, a psychiatrist, can play in the life of a unit. It is with this experience in mind that I express some reservations as to the systematic elimination of psychopaths. I was most surprised indeed to see several men, even officers, who, however psychiatrically inadequate they may have appeared to me, behaved extremely usefully and admirably at the front. Dr. Bonifay, I recognize with pleasure the convergence of the achievements just presented to us with the doctrinal perspectives and the plans of reconstruction of which I, together with numerous colleagues from psychiatric hospitals, have made myself the defender, relying on a social definition of the sick man and advocating a radical reform of asylum treatment. Psychologists, carried along by the current maturation of their science, have reached the same point in their reflection thanks to an analogous experience, an experience of group which, although very different in value and structure, have the following common trait. They realize social forms, simple and strong, with lively angles, a choice terrain, thus, for the experimentation of a collective psychology worthy of its name. To respond to Mr. Evi's comments, I wish to emphasize that it has never been a question of bestowing the task of governing the world upon psychiatrists, but only of letting their advice be heard by those who govern. It is thus that Domaison and I were able to offer our advice on the project to reform the civil service, the various chapters of which could no doubt seem to exceed the field of their competence. As to the term of banality, which was employed earlier, there is no scientific discovery that did not find its root in a new way of considering banality. The reality of the asylum, when I think about it, does not seem to me to be that banal, at least if one is to consider it in the full relief of its social structure. I'm interested to the utmost in the peacetime extension of posts created in the war, in the civil equivalents which have been set up, and lastly, in the incidences of collective psychotherapy in civil hospital practice. Dr. Minkowski, he's saying this, whatever the importance of social factors may be in mental disorders, the later, however, prove to have their own morbid structure. And even though I may pass for reactionary, I do think that psychiatry should be wary of going too far down the road of a pure sociology. Dr. Sellier, it seems obvious to me that the term psychiatry does imply the notion of a disease. Major Turkey, a preventive orientation of medicine cannot afford to neglect either the problem of the normal or that of the social, nor should it misrecognize the psychogenetic origin of mental disorders. In Britain, we have accomplished our task with the help of sociologists and psychologists, many of whom had little experience with patients. Dr. Binoy, who's a guest, in my dual capacity as academic psychologist and as a psychologist having carried out the specific functions of a psychiatrist, I feel somewhat inclined to criticize the training of the first for the benefit of the second. There should be two categories of psychiatrists applying themselves to different functions. What is at stake, no doubt, in the sector under study is a field of experience which poses the problem of the normal. The psychiatrists are those who deciphered it. They brought the doctrine there. It is for them to implement it. Dr. Senges, I believe, as was mentioned earlier, that the core of our mission is to study the psychopathology of patients, insofar as it differentiates itself from normal human behavior. Dr. Minkowski, if I may bring a note of humor to this debate and to echo the words of Dr. Binoy, I will recall the story of the reply a number of psychological advisors received when recently appointed. They got in touch with a university professor of psychology, for this is what he told them: I never have taught anything to my students which could have a practical application. Professor Berman, I wish to stress once more the positive nature of the new development of psychiatry. One may compare the position of traditional psychiatry with that of physiology before Lacan. Dr. Schiff, it seems to me that it may be useful to evoke in this discussion the work of the collective Psychology Society, founded in 1936 by Alendi Bataille, A. Borel, Lyris, and myself, as well as the existence in the United States of a journal dedicated to social psychology. I agree with Professor Berman insofar as I find it impossible to accept that the data available to psychoanalysis be used to characterize certain political movements. Such perspectives lend themselves to abuse, and all parties have shown themselves to be generous with the latter in their dealings with their advisories. Without lingering upon the reckless nature of most pathographies, be they by Flaubert or Rousseau, and the manifest ill adaptation of our psychiatric and characterologic science to the man of genius, I cannot resist evoking some facts, such as the article by Professor Adalbert Gregor, published in the German Review of Mental Hygiene of 1936, in which we read that a communist had to be transferred to the psychiatric wing of the prison, for he had manifested his sure sign of madness, of not understanding, despite all kinds of exhortations, the extent to which his opinions were incompatible with the new order of the Third Reich. Dr. Lacan, I thank those who have volunteered their accord, as well as those who have been my contradictors in their remarks and objections. I wish to affirm once more my unitary conception in anthropology. To the objections of principle raised against the role of psychiatry during the war, I reply with Epure Simov, there is a footnote. After being forced to recant, Galileo added Epure Simov, which is, and yet it moves.
Yes, we are done.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay, planning that my expose be given any other sense or any other merit.
Okay. Yep.
hold on.
Thank you, Deepthi, firstly for taking over double of what was your reading first, and I must say that, you know, somewhere in the text, the word generosity that I heard stays with me, because I think this event is an act of generosity on many people's part. And Janet, for first proposing that it be a collaboration between Alasdair and me, which made it possible for a group of British readers and a group of Indian readers to come together. Alasdair, who very evocatively told me when I asked him last Saturday, do we have the time to pull it off, Alasdair? Isn't it too late to get an event in less than 6 days? And he said, well, I thought it's better to try than let a colleague's desire die.
Oh.
And I think that made me come on board. Thank you, Alasdair. And to the 12 readers that eventually became 11 readers in this session, but never mind. I think Oriol read the text and he intended to be here. To the 12 readers, thanks are due for accepting the request at very short notice and being ready to do what it takes to read the text. Thank you all. And lastly, I think Lacan would have approved of the very eclectic quality of the listeners. We have students of English literature, we have group relations practitioners, we have analysts, and we have analysts in training. I think the listening audience would have made that man happy, because that is what he wanted, a cartel to be, not monopolized by any one field of expertise, which he thought is very detrimental to creation of any new knowledge. So thank you all and have a good day. We have ended the reading.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.